Hello, I'm very honored to open this little panel or this little dialogue on vulnerability for the first Australasian Change Days. So I have with me some very nice folks from around the world, which I would like to introduce, or ask them to introduce. My name is Holger Nauheimer. I'm in Berlin, and I'm very happy to have with me Sarika Kharbanda, Sakshi Bansal, Eugenio, Moliní, and Cherelle Witney. So, folks, please introduce yourselves and tell us who are you, where are you, or where do you live? And maybe also a short answer, but a very short answer, and why is this a conversation you want to be part of? I would ask Sarika to start, please.
Sure. So let me start with who am I? Or where am I? So that's the first one. So I'm in Pune in India. And who am I? I'm essentially a change hacker. I try to poke holes into everything that I do, including myself as an individual, departments and organizations I work with, everybody. So that's essentially what I do. I explore how to nudge change forward by understanding and valuing multiple perspectives. And that's me with perspectives of change all the way. Why am I here for being a part of this conversation? Actually, vulnerability is pretty personal to me. And in the sense that it's not a topic I've seen a lot of people talk about, at least in the cultures and organizations and departments, or even personally with people that I've worked with. So yeah, I'm hoping that this conversation allows me an opportunity to listen in, learn from others' experiences, of course, and also be listened to and influence something in some way.
Thank you, Sarika. Sakshi, would you go next, please?
Thank you, Holger. And I think, Sarika, what you said was beautiful there. My name is Sakshi Bansal, like you said, and I'm in London at the moment. I'm from India, but moved here a couple of years ago, and I am essentially a change maker. So frontline changing, working with a lot of vulnerable kids, vulnerable families, and teaching them since 4 years in different parts of the world. But I think over the years, the thing that has shaped me the most is being able to influence vulnerability, to kind of chase that out of people. So I've been chasing stories for a long time. I've been chasing people and how they have shaped and changed the world in their own tiny little ways for a long time. And that is what I bring together when I talk to people. And a lot of times I say, let's join hands, let's stranger meet stranger. And for me, that is the biggest part of my life, traveling, social work, and talking to strangers. And they're all connected by being vulnerable, being able to say, this is who I am and this is who you are. And for me, this is such an important conversation to kind of reach that ultimate point.
And you brought up some interesting points on which I want to pick up later, and I really like that you in particular pronounce the second syllable of it, or the third one, the ability of being vulnerable. Thank you. Eugenio, please go next.
Well, Eugenio Moliní, I am in Stockholm, Sweden, and well, I support people, individuals and organizations to promote change with more impact and less pain. I have seen too many change agents driven by their passion that just create a lot of pain around themselves. So that's my mission and what I do. And the reason I am here is just because, well, when somebody believes that I have something to say, I always feel flattered, even if that's not their intention. So I am not immune. So that's it. Somebody invited me believing that I have something to say, so maybe I have something to say. We'll see.
And you have, Eugenio, you have. Thank you. And finally, Cherelle Witney, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Holger. I'm in Perth in Australia, and I have a couple of businesses. My main consultancy is called Lift, and what it does as its focus is lift leaders and teams to be at their vulnerable best. So my work is very connected to vulnerability around courage, creating that connection and sense of belonging that ultimately builds trust. And in the corporate sector, trust is the holy grail. You know, once you've got people that trust their leader, once the teams trust each other, you get all the fantastic things around agility and high performance and all of that. But of course, without it, you get the flip side. So that's my day job. I have a side gig, which is called Tricky Treats, which is an invention for dogs home alone. And that creates a nice inventive space for me to be in and walk my talk about vulnerability, because inventing something and bringing it to market, I have discovered, is one of the most vulnerable things I've done in my journey so far. I'm really privileged to be part of this conversation. I love to talk about vulnerability because it doesn't get talked about enough. And I was lucky enough to train with Brené Brown, who's one of the leading international thought leaders and researchers on the subject a few years ago. So I blend it into all my work, and I do believe it creates connection, it gives us a sense of belonging, and ultimately helps us lift our worthiness. So if I could be part of that in some way, even in my personal circle, in my family and friends, as well as with the leaders and the corporate work I do with teams, I feel very purposeful when I'm doing that. Doesn't come without its challenges, because you have to walk your talk, of course. So I need to make sure I have a vulnerable path in my life as well, and not always the wise teacher or the coach, but doing things in my life where I'm outside of my comfort zone. And that makes my life joyful as well. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Holger, for the opportunity and challenge space.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. And you brought up already a lot of interesting aspects. And let me introduce into our debate by going back to the roots. I did a little bit of research, and obviously vulnerability derives from the Latin word vulnerare, which means to be wounded, and describes the potential to be harmed physically or emotionally. Let's remember that the concept originally, like in the 70s, was introduced within the discourse of natural hazards and disaster. So it was more related to communities and later to individuals, and it referred to lack of access to resources, disintegration of social patterns, degradation of the environment, the physical environment, lack of strong national and local political resources or institutions, and weak buildings. So if I think about those factors, probably we are all not very vulnerable as we are sitting here. And then interesting, well, Wikipedia referred to it as an ability of a system to withstand the effects of a hostile environment. So it sounds to me kind of the opposite to resilience, and let's maybe discuss that a little bit later. And it's interesting that these two concepts, resilience and vulnerability, both were introduced into, let's say, the discourse of coaches and facilitators and people like us. Already, Cherelle, you mentioned Brené Brown 10 years ago, the famous TEDx talk at Houston, which I watched yesterday again, which still moves me into tears, obviously brought this conversation about vulnerability into our discourse. And there are a lot of different approaches to explain the phenomena. For example, I found Nick Wignall, a psychologist, who writes in a blog post, it's the willingness to acknowledge your emotions, especially painful ones. That's a bit strange, as it turns the original meaning of vulnerability around, at least as I understand, because the original was to avoid vulnerability, and now kind of in the public discourse, it's you have to show vulnerability. Mark Manson, another guy, excuse me, even says that vulnerability is the key to better relationships. And Brené Brown kind of says the same thing. She says it's the birthplace of joy, creativity, belonging, and love. So we have these different aspects of vulnerability, and I'm interested to hear more about that. So you said already a little bit about how you came across the issue of vulnerability and what does it mean to you, and why do you think it's such a visible issue now? Is it becoming a tick in the box? And I would like to start with Cherelle again, as you talked about Brené Brown, why do you think it's such a visible concept suddenly for the last, let's say, 10 years?
I think there's no denying that her TEDx talk made a difference, and now it's up to 50 million views. So it's certainly a viral thing, and whenever anything goes viral, whether it's perhaps useful like this or it's, you know, the latest way to floss, you know, then whatever it might be, the latest dance move or anything that's viral, it touches a lot of people. And I think she ended up talking, you know, in Fortune 500 companies. She ended up on the most powerful woman, arguably, on the planet's TV show, Oprah Winfrey, and then onto Netflix. You know, that whole marketing kind of thing happened around her. And for me, I guess I view it as she touched a subconscious chord, perhaps with us, that we already knew there was this other side of vulnerability, that we'd grown up with the vulnerability of weakness, and, you know, we better protect ourselves about it and have that armor. But underneath, subconsciously, I think as a community worldwide, we knew there might be another path. And for me, she made that simple. She talked about terms that we could understand, and ultimately reframed that vulnerability based on her research as a strength. You know, what if it is a strength? What if we could be vulnerable and connect? And what if we could be letting go of some of that armor or that defense that we've built up our whole lives and actually have a more joyful life? What if it's not as dangerous as we've been led to believe, or that the risk is worth it? So I think her defining it in the terms of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure is probably no different than the way vulnerability has already been determined in the past. It is risky, it is emotionally exposed, and it is uncertain a lot of the time. But her research, 13,000 pieces of data, 10 plus years, made us feel a little bit like maybe it's worth giving this a go in a different context rather than pushing it away. So for me, that's how I've seen it. And like you, Holger, I've watched that TEDx talk, I don't know how many times, because it's part of my pieces of work, and I can still get emotional about hearing her say that we numb, and that when we numb out vulnerability, we numb out joy, as well as the dangers that we might perceive with vulnerability. So I think it touched our subconscious. That would be my answer in a nutshell, and made it safe and positive to talk about, and then the world has taken it from there.
Thank you. Sakshi, as far as I understand, you approach the concept of vulnerability from a little bit different angle, because you're working with people who are actually vulnerable, because they fit into one of the categories I mentioned before. What do you make up of the concept of vulnerability in modern times?
I think, Holger, vulnerability is such an ordinary excellence. You know, it is such it's such an ordinary pleasure that we fail to indulge in. And I think what Cherelle said, that, you know, initially it was very one-way street of somebody else, of seeing the community as vulnerable and then trying to help them. And that is what we did for years. You know, we would approach these communities as an outsider and say, we are going to help you, and we're going to make your lives better. But now it's more reciprocity. Now it is more two-way street. If they're vulnerable, you are vulnerable as well. So I think how I've seen that in practical life is actually going to the field and talking to these people and saying, I know you have issues, I have issues too, you know, and actually volunteers opening up to kids, sharing dangerous parts of their lives, or not so good parts of their lives, or their hardships. And actually I've seen strangers just come up and talk about aspects of life, and that has become very okay to do. That has become very unguarded, selfless thing to do, which is, I think, a random act of kindness almost. So I think when we say that, you know, vulnerability was marketed very well and then it was done very well on a bigger level, I think it did trickle down, and it trickled down in a way that it's okay to be vulnerable, and that it is a two-way street. You cannot help somebody without both parties being equally vulnerable. So I think it has brought the power balance almost to a nice little equal there of both of us being able to be vulnerable and then help each other out. So I think that's how it's playing out a little bit.
Interesting, and without going too far away from our original concept, it reminds me a little bit, obviously, of the concept of anti-fragility that Nicholas Taleb introduced at around the same time. So, which would mean, translated into our conversation, that vulnerability actually, or showing vulnerability, or sharing vulnerability, makes you stronger. Eugenio, you in your work, you talk a lot about pain, and you mentioned that already in your introduction. What does the concept of vulnerability mean for you in your work?
Well, in my experience and way of thinking, it's always based on my own experience and what I have seen, no? And its vulnerability comes from two places. It's when we are hurt or when we love. That's the origin of vulnerability, no? So for me, the interesting thing is that, well, I am concerned that vulnerability has become a means to an end or an end in itself. And for me, that's not, I don't agree. If I understand Brené Brown well, it doesn't agree with my experience. What she said, well, in some way, the important thing for me is the origin. So can I, as a professional, express love by giving the best of myself and then accept the vulnerability that comes with that? Not seek the vulnerability in itself, but be there, and this is what I have to give, and I don't know if anybody will want it, but this is what I have to give. Then that's the moment when we are the most vulnerable, no? Then there's the other kind of vulnerability. Well, it's the same kind of vulnerability, but the one that comes from that you have been very hurt. And then your capacity, and that comes the connection with resilience. My capacity to recover or protect myself or support myself or even seek the support of others is diminished. So in those situations of where the vulnerability comes from pain, asking people to be able, people or collectives or individuals, to show themselves as vulnerable is the same thing as asking them to stop protecting themselves in dangerous situation, objectively dangerous situation. And that's a disservice. That's a disservice, no? So I have come to understand that mediocrity in workplaces is an unholy alliance between men and women to say we will not hurt each other. Because if you don't give, nobody gives the best of himself or herself, then nobody gets hurt. So mediocrity is an act of love, paradoxically. Allow me to express it like this, no?
Yeah, what comes to my mind, and maybe we can talk about that later, is what happens if there is no reciprocity. Yeah, if I'm showing vulnerability, or if I'm vulnerable, but other people who I'm in conversation with aren't. Let's just cover that later, but I would like to hear from Sarika. Sarika, obviously we have two Indian on our panel, but you are an Indian also currently living in India, and I think a lot of people are very vulnerable there in the moment, as I see the TV reports. So from your perspective, what does vulnerability mean?
Sure. I think I'm going to start a bit broader as a context, because I've been only working in India for the past 4 years, and I've pretty much had a global connect before that. For me, vulnerability, like I said, when I was introducing my connect to it, is quite personal. And it always brings this question to me: why do we, after a certain age of growth and development as human beings, have to be starting to be told that we need to be vulnerable? When we were not adults, we were still quite vulnerable. As a child, I think I've been very vulnerable. Most of us probably have. And we don't think twice when we have to say something, ask for something. Of course, there would be exceptions, but in general, that would be a pattern. And I think personally for me, as I grew up in the cultures and the societies that I lived and worked in globally, it's just been a very personal journey where vulnerability for me has been at the root of trust and connection. And those are also the values that I like to exhibit, and I love to see those being exhibited by people who I work with, because especially in the world today where connectedness is key, I don't think we can get that kind of connectedness without the trust and the vulnerability that's, at the root of everything. For me, things in terms of vulnerability have never been abnormal to do, because it used to be my authentic self doing things, being vulnerable, saying, oh, you know what? I think I have a lot of challenges out here. Guess what? I can't do this alone. I need everybody's help to do this from a practitioner point of view. And then that's where one person actually came to me and said, hey, that was very courageous of you as a leader to actually say that, because we wouldn't expect in the society or in the hierarchical cultures of the organization that you're working in, Sarika, nobody would say that. And I was like, really? And I think that was one point which introduced me to the fact that, okay, there is something different that I've done from people's perspective. Maybe I need to look at what that perspective is. And honestly, before that, I never even thought of a concept of vulnerability. This was, of course, many years ago, like more than 15 years ago is what I'm talking about. And that kind of connected me to the fact that there are aspects that I do open up to, which is not natural for people to look at in the way that I do. And of course, there's something that's called vulnerability, and we talk about that. And I think that's when I started to create my own journey, or let's say a path to wisdom, as you call it. But it was my own journey to be connected with myself in a very big way, because I understood myself as a better person. So I always used to think about this inner voice in me, which is always talking and saying, okay, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to stop. This is what you need to start. In terms of being vulnerable, how do you channel your vulnerabilities in the right direction? And I started coaching myself essentially to first acknowledge my vulnerabilities and even understand them, because I knew they were there, but I just didn't know that they were also called vulnerabilities, interestingly. Which is why when I talk about myself as a change hacker, I also say I disrupt, I unleash, but I co-create, because only through co-creation with yourself and with people around you can I move things forward, or can I enable to move things forward.
So thanks very much for this first round of introductions. I think we got a lot of stuff to think about, and this is the point where we want to bring the participants in. Yeah, welcome back, and I'm sure the participants had quite some good time in discussing the different concepts that we had laid out in the first part of our conversation. We touched already a little bit on the professional meaning of vulnerability. I would hear a little bit more on how that surfaces in the work you're doing. How are you dealing with? Are you trying to show your vulnerability, or are you trying to resist it? And just a little story from my side. It's not one story, it's many stories. In the moments when I showed vulnerability, when I showed that I felt hurt, as you said in the first round, Eugenio, I met people who did not show their vulnerability, but who used their power to put me down. And I destroyed relationships by showing my vulnerability, because I was raw, I was mean, I was just open, and other people couldn't really deal with it. So that was in professional settings. I'm not talking about private settings, which again is another issue. So maybe Eugenio, maybe you can start because I think you're really an expert. You have thought a lot about that issue, and so how do you deal with it in your professional settings? How do you make the balance?
Well, as I said, vulnerability for me is not a means and it's not an end. It's a consequence. And in professional settings, it's also a consequence of either I am giving the best of myself, an expression of love. So the issue is not if I should show or not my vulnerability, is if I should keep giving in this context the best of myself, or shall I withdraw? No, and that makes a completely different choice for me. No, because that's why I say that vulnerability in itself doesn't have any value.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example, Eugenio?
Well, if I am, for example, I am working with a client, the first meeting I have with a client, and after half an hour, I see that the client doesn't want my way of working. They are trying to tell me how to do my work. And that hurts me because I am here to give the best of myself and you called me and you don't want it. So the choice is not to show my vulnerability, it is to say, okay, do you want what I have to give? Then you need to accept it. If not, I am going with my gift somewhere else. No? That could be one example. No? Okay. One of the most recent examples. No? So it's not about opening my heart and everything to get even more hurt than I have been during my life. That would be.
Sarika, in the first round, you talked about how that issue of vulnerability plays into your private and professional life. Can you give us an example that makes it clearer how you deal with it in professional situations?
Sure. I think the example that comes to my mind is a story, and I'll try to keep it concise. And that story really starts with all the challenges that you can think of in the world, different cultures, different countries, different challenges, abusive environment, not conducive for good team collaboration. And this is leaders I'm talking about. With all of that being there, and Sarika is supposed to help and enable transformations. And I was like, okay, this is great. I found out everybody's perspective, but how do I enable it? And I think the best approach I found at that time, going back to also what Eugenio said, so of course it hurts you. And you're like, how do you enable that hurt in some way? So honestly, for me, it was about being transparent. Hey, people, I hear you. I see the pain that you're going through. I see your perspectives, but understand that we can't do this. And I can't do this alone. I need everybody's help to do it. I think that itself, with me setting myself up for a very open exposure that I am unable to do this myself, and the fact that I need your help to do this, that itself was like a culture shocker for many people to be able to understand that, oh, wow, a leader is asking for my help or our help, and she can't do it without us. So just as bullet points, I would say, yes, setting up myself as a person who's vulnerable, exposing my vulnerability that I can't do anything here without you. And this is our common goal and we need to achieve that together. And then allowing people to be vulnerable themselves at certain points. And of course, it's not going to happen overnight. It's a journey. And then I take them through that journey, and once they know that, you have their back and you are there to support them. So for me, vulnerability, trust becomes really key. And that's the kind of environment I like to create before I can take my teams as leaders, as management, as teams on that journey in my professional world.
Thank you. Cherelle, I really would like to discuss with you whether we are walking our talk or whether we are just using vulnerability as a big concept to talk about. I mean, obviously, Brené Brown in her TED Talks and particularly in some of her books walks the talk because she talks very personal about stories where she felt hurt. Are you walking the talk, Cherelle? And how?
It's a good question. I am, but I think as a facilitator, a teacher, a lecturer, any of those roles where we're seen as the expert, it can be very easy to not walk your talk. So when I'm delivering keynotes on vulnerability, I have to make sure that I'm actually being vulnerable in those keynotes. Otherwise, I'm kind of preaching from the pulpit, and that's then the complete irony, isn't it? My topic is about vulnerability, yet I'm not appearing vulnerable in any way. I think that's really important. It's chicken and egg. Am I attracted to that work because I need to do that work, or does the work for me? I'm not sure how that life journey happens, but I find it very empowering. And as we were talking about earlier, it is a bit of reciprocity that when I do a keynote about vulnerability and I stand in front of a group of people and be vulnerable, there is a two-way energy exchange there, and it's a joyful, fantastic, uplifting thing that happens. I would say that there needs to be boundaries around that. Brené Brown's very clear in her training of us as facilitators that you need to do your own work first, that you're not using your groups for therapy, that if you haven't worked through your own stories and your own issues, then that's not the time to be sharing those stories and those issues with groups, because that is actually not a vulnerable space where it's a two-way exchange. You're not holding the space for other people to be in the space, you're taking up the space. So she does, in her training, require us to do a lot of work around our own vulnerabilities, our own shame, our own stories, things like that. And that's a lifelong process, because as we go through life, different things happen and different things trigger us. So I would say boundaries is very important to vulnerability, especially when you're hurt, and you need to be consciously making decisions about when you'll be vulnerable. I'm always coaching leaders on when is it appropriate for them to share certain stories, certain things that are going on for them with their team, and when is it not. Otherwise it does become something that's more like manipulation or a false thing that you're doing in order to get an outcome, when actually the essence of vulnerability is just our humanness, speaking from our heart. And as we've been saying, without knowing the outcome, giving the best of ourselves without knowing if the outcome will be this way or that way. For me, that's true vulnerability. And if that's not the case, then it's more likely a process. And I think that's when we get a confusion about vulnerability and what it's actually doing within us as humans and within our corporate structure as leaders and team developers. If you speak to any kind of therapist, mental health person that works in those areas, they'll always talk about the moment of vulnerability is when the person that they're helping or treating or supporting makes a shift, when they're aware and they're in that space of being vulnerable. And I think that's the same for all of us in our families, our loving relationships, in our conflicts. The moment we're more vulnerable, the moment we have more connection, and other things can happen that are hopefully more positive.
Yeah, thank you. Sakshi, you mentioned already earlier that you are trying to demonstrate this reciprocity when you're working with vulnerable communities and people. Can you make that a little bit more specific? Can you give some examples how you do that?
Definitely. I think, Holger, for me, a way of doing that is first what Cherelle said, is you need to work through your own stories. What hurt you, where were you vulnerable in your entire lives? And for me, that started a little early, and that started when I was doing a lot of solo traveling, and I was traveling alone in the world and talking to strangers. And I think that really gave me that push and said, that concept, that beauty of just sitting with somebody who doesn't know me is so important. I know that as leaders, we are always, thinking about where are the boundaries and where does it become manipulation. But I think that process itself of sitting with a stranger is super pure in its own essence. So that's where I started, and how I brought that into where I work and into where 300 volunteers are looking up to you and saying, where do we go now? How do we do this? How do we make a change? I think where we brought that in is doing these sessions of simulating strangers meeting strangers. So I do this series called Social Library, where I talk to people. I say, I'm looking for stories, nominate yourself. People talk about their stories. And a lot of times what I see is, when people are filling a form for the first time, they'll say, I moved countries. And I have to always give them a call and say, let's talk. What's your story? And then sit with them and really tease those stories out and say, you talked about your art. You just spoke about that incident. Why don't you write that? That's your story. That's your vulnerability. Apart from a larger context of I moved countries. So you have to really tease out the vulnerability and show them that there are smaller incidences that changed you, that you probably don't write, but they are there. And then when they are ready, when they feel like, oh yes, that's the incident that changed me, that's when they sit in an open space, in a park or in an auditorium, and we have people outside who are reading their stories, their snippets of their stories. And if somebody connects, if somebody feels like, I like that story, they go in, and that person is sitting right in front of them for 30 minutes for them to have a chat, to have a conversation, to be vulnerable, to exchange that. And I think that brings both human beings to a very similar page, that brings both of them to an open, vulnerable space, and they've shared their hearts out. And I feel like now my volunteers are prime. Now they are ready for going out and saying, we have worked through our stories, and we have done this, and we've been through a process where we understand what vulnerable feels, what the other person is feeling like when they're saying, I have an alcoholic parent and they don't let me study. How do I come to school? It just lets you connect. It just lets you understand. And that's how I am almost priming 300 volunteers to do that every day. And a big part of that is doing that myself. And over the years, some stories I kept very guarded with me. There were boundaries with those stories. I did not want to share them. These stories were things about when I was in a depression state, or when I was being bullied for my skin color. And just yesterday, one of the stories came out in one of the sessions like this. And what I realized is I'm over it. Finally, finally, I feel okay with being brown, and I shared it. And it was fine to do that. So
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sakshi, because that brings me to my last point. That was a perfect introduction, because my big question is, particularly in the context we are talking about, in the context of what followed after Brené Brown's TED Talk, isn't vulnerability in that context, or showing vulnerability, a luxury? I mean, if I were a Black lower class person in an American city, I would try to do anything to get out of vulnerability, to get into a safe space. So here we are. I mean, most of us, to different degrees of a good status, upper middle class or middle class, educated people. At least I don't have the risk of an earthquake around me here, maybe some storms in fall or so. So I'm not physical vulnerable. So isn't it a big privilege, and wouldn't some other people in other situations just shake their heads about us? Who wants to go first now?
I'm happy to speak first. I think it's a great question. It got me thinking about it. For me, vulnerability is a behaviour. It's that moment when you decide to speak from your heart. And I don't feel that is determined by race or culture or how much your bank balance is. I think that everyone struggles with it because it's part of being human. And so if we're taking, from my point of view, vulnerability as being uncertain, risky, emotionally exposed, as opposed to, is the building I'm living in, structurally safe? If we're taking that kind of definition about exposure, emotionally risky, uncertain, I think famous people, that would be considered to have this amazing life often struggle with vulnerability, the same as someone who doesn't have all those material trappings maybe even more so, because they worry more about what people think. I don't know. But what I do know is that in the work that I do, leaders and teams come in all shapes and sizes, and the one thing they have in common is that they're looking to connect. And they're looking to connect individually, they're looking to connect as a whole to their organisation. And once vulnerability is something, as we've been talking about, that you practice and get better at and understand how to speak from your heart, and is it safe to speak from my heart? Is the space that I'm in safe to speak from my heart? Once you get that courage within you, then you're going to do it more. So for me, the question is more around how do we view vulnerability rather than is it a privilege, but how do we help people to get into that courageous space where they could be vulnerable and have more connections than they have at the current moment.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I had something to add there, Holger. I think this question came to me, and people often do ask me that, you come from an educated background. Why do you think that people who don't have that privilege will listen to you, and how do they respond to you? How do they care about you? And I feel that there is almost an action attached to vulnerability. It is, what do you do with it? What do you do about it? We all have stories, we all have moments where we have been hurt or we have loved too much. And like Eugenio said, that's vulnerability. So there is an action attached to it of what I did with it, what I made out of it. And I think same for anybody else, wherever they are. You gave an example, Holger, of a black man in America who doesn't have those, who doesn't have the capacity to move forward. I've seen those communities use vulnerability and use their situations in the most powerful way of storytelling, of engaging people, of talking about what their situation is. And I think there's an action attached to vulnerability, which is what we need to understand, which is why we are having this discussion at the end.
I would like to add also that, two things. One is that I believe that oppression can be created towards a collective and individual, no? And introjecting or taking into your system the oppressor and doing it to yourself is also done at the individual level and at the collective level. But liberation, the real liberation, comes always at the individual level. At the collective, you can do anger, you can do revolution, you can do that, but that's not liberation. No. So now I forgot what I was going to say in the connection to your question, but maybe you see it. No, I thought that there was a very clear connection. And the other thing is a story I read in the accounts of some of the civil rights activists in the 60s and 70s in the US. They said that they did groups to share their stories of fear in front of the police or in front of the Ku Klux Klan and so on. No, and how could they continue the non-violent practice? No. And one of the consequences of that was that the FBI, the spies from the FBI, disappeared because they couldn't really show who they were. No? So the acknowledging of vulnerability and fear in those settings made it impossible for the oppressor to be in the room. And that's a secondary effect of continue to give the best of yourself. And the best of yourself as in a situation of liberation is to continue the non-violent action.
Thank you, Eugenio.
So for me, I definitely resonate with what everybody's already said, but just to add a couple more aspects to it, I think a safe space is very key for people if they have to be vulnerable enough. It was important for me, and it is important for everybody to be feeling, safe enough that they can open up and talk things about themselves. So when I am enabling people to do that, I do want to ensure that they can sense that safety, and then they open up to be their vulnerable best at whatever situation they are in. Of course, it needs a lot of courage. It's not easy, and you have to follow through all aspects of going through the shame and having the courage to talk about it in the different instances. So nothing more to add to that. It's not easy, has to be done.
Thank you. So let's close our round maybe with a personal statement about what we've discussed, but going deep inside into yourself, thinking about, okay, where has vulnerability touched you? And as I said before, for me, my statement is show your vulnerability, but make sure that other people are getting onto the same level with you. Don't use it as a weapon. Cherelle?
For me, it's about living your life bravely. I'm an eternal optimist, so I always am looking to lift myself and the leaders and teams I work with to show up and be seen, to be at their best. That's going to require vulnerability. It's going to be uncomfortable, going to get hurt. But the other side of vulnerability that creates connection and joy and love, all of those things, what would life be without those? So for me, in a change concept, whether you're changing yourself or your leadership or your team, it's vulnerability that's the key to creating those connections and making change actually stick, making it work. You can have the best process, but if we don't talk about emotions and behaviours and possibly what's holding us back inside here and here, then that change process isn't going to work without that vulnerable discussion.
Eugenio?
When I was in the worst personal and professional crisis in my life, I didn't know anything. I was so deeply hurt that I was completely paralyzed. Somebody called me and told me, I know that you are in deep shit, so my home is open for you. Please come, and you can stay here as long as you need to heal. So in the end, the more hurt, the deeper you are into your vulnerability, into your pain, the more difficult it is to ask for help. So somebody needs to just stretch their hand and say, please come.
Thank you. Sarika?
So I think, I would say self-care comes first. That's what I would start with in terms of vulnerability, which means you need to acknowledge and be vulnerable yourself to be able to bring that vulnerability in others. And only, I think this is something what Harriet Lerner says, only through our connectedness can we really know and enhance the self, and only through knowing the self can we, begin to be more connected with others. Be vulnerable yourself, be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and you will get there.
Thank you. And Sakshi?
You're good. I think as a 22-year-old change maker or a leader, I don't think anything has helped me more than trusting that other people understand or will understand, if not now, then someday. Having a little bit faith that your story is important, and you can make something out of it, be it a professional life or a personal relationship. And then also having the courage to form connections, real quality connections from that vulnerability that arises. So for me, it's a personal journey that I can't switch off. I can't switch off being vulnerable, but I can put action to my vulnerability, and I can become a better leader through that. That for me.
And that sounds like the closing remarks. Thanks very much, Sakshi. Thanks, everybody. I think we created some connection over the last 45 minutes or so, and thanks for being part of that.
Thank you.